Good evening. I hope you've all had a good week. Still coming in, one or two more left to go. I tell you what, it's been chilly this week. That much I do know for certain. It does not feel like spring. It feels more like cold November and December mornings. But anyway, fingers crossed. According to the forecast, I was just watching a bit of country file before it came up. It's due to get a little bit warmer, hopefully. Let's hope so, because it was cold over the last couple of days. Right, I hope we had a good week. I hope everybody's well. Messages coming in already. Jolly good. Right, let me do my usual bit and get confused as to which screen I'm on. That doesn't take much these days.
Episode 45. We are smooth by this point.
We are smooth by this point. Yeah, absolutely. Right, let me just share the right one. Go.
Yep, all good.
Excellent. Good evening, everybody. Welcome along. As Grant said, episode 45. We were just talking about May is nearly here. This year's shot past a phenomenal rate. It really has. Anyway, we are where we are. Come on. There we go. Okay, so usual format, questions in the chat if you've got some, and again, we'll come to you at the end of the Q&A session. You can unmute yourselves and ask your question as we would normally do. If you can't, just let me know somehow, and we'll ask the question for you. That's not a problem. And we are recording tonight's session, so that will be available if you're unable to make it. And if you're watching on catch up, where were you tonight? So welcome along to Mary McIntyre again. We met Mary at the beginning of March with her guide to Sketching the Moon and showing off some of her amazing artwork, and it really was great to see that. We are delighted that she's returned this week. Her diary is very busy, so we're really pleased that she was able to squeeze us in again, and this time to give us a talk on a history of women in astronomy. And we're going to find out some more about some of the lesser known women and the role they play in astronomy. And we might learn one or two more names apart from just Caroline Herschel, because I have to say that's about it. Well, no, tell a lie. I also know the lady Hester Peregrine Hawkins, who was in Bedford many years ago.
That's a good name, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Anyway, enough from me. So, Mary, I will stop sharing and I will hand over to you.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me for my, this is a tough talk to have put together, because when I started digging into this subject, like you guys, you think of Caroline Herschel onwards, and thankfully I was asked to write an article for the Yearbook of Astronomy, the 2021 edition, and it was with that kind of angle of male mentors for women in astronomy, and I'm going to talk about why that was an issue in a second. And it kind of uncovered all of these people that I feel I should have already known and already didn't. So I'm going to try and squeeze as much of that in as I possibly can tonight. Woven into that, I'm going to talk about some of the societal issues and why this has caused problems for women working in astronomy. Now, from the beginning, I want to just make the point that anything I talk about tonight with regards to bad experiences is all with a view of wanting there to be an equality within the workplace or within the amateur community. It's not from a feminist standpoint at all. So quite often as a female, if you ever speak out about some of the kind of imbalances within male-female astronomy, you get labeled a shrieking Harrod and all the rest of it. And that's very much not what I'm doing here. I'm just trying to highlight why there is actually an issue. And at the end, actually, some of the things that will fix it. And some of the things that I think are quite important within this field. And I want to say as well that when I was born in 1973, and I grew up in a working class household in Lancashire. And throughout my entire childhood, I never once heard from either parent that I couldn't do something because I was a girl. And it was only when I got to high school and started to then get the you're a blonde bimbo with your body shape, you should be a glamour model, you can't do science, and people literally betting me that I would fail my maths exam. And this is when I started to kind of get this kind of, why do people people think girls are thick, because I just never experienced it at home. And believe me, my mind changed many times about what career path I wanted to follow, but never once were my parents unsupportive with any of my decisions, whether it be hobbies, careers, courses, whatever. And I feel extremely grateful to my family for that, because our household was a household of equality. And that has meant that at times I can be a little bit bullshy when it comes to sexism, but I'm really glad that it meant that I could just follow my heart rather than what society expected of me. If we dip back a little bit in history, you find some of these quite entertaining adverts. For example, the things women have to put up with. Most husbands nowadays have stopped beating their wives. It leaves an extremely bitter taste in my mouth that you could even use that comment so flippantly in an advertising campaign. I can't even remember what this advert's for, but that's irrelevant. The fact that domestic abuse is some kind of funny quip in an advert is really awful. And also the classic women drivers thing. And sooner or later, your wife will drive home. So that's why you should have a Volkswagen, because clearly that bumper has totally stopped the wing from caving in. And just because the wife is going to drive home doesn't mean the car is going to get crashed. And we laugh about these things, but when it's just dripping into your psyche constantly as a young child, it's the same with prejudices towards men as well. It's not just women. These things start to eat away at your self-esteem and your confidence. And this is certainly a problem with young girls who love astronomy, but something happens in their teens that make them think they can't do physics and astronomy. And I think this plays a role, and this just overt sexism within advertising. Thankfully, it's getting better, but it's not gone. Oh, a woman can even open this ketchup bottle. It's more subtle when you get toys that are labeled as a boys' game. You will quite often get the box depicting father and son enjoying a game together. That's fine, but why do we need the girl helping mum wash up in the background? Just show them playing the game. That's bad enough that it's just male, but to actually have that such gender stereotyping on a game box is just really awful. And again, this was seen throughout history when it came to toys and games. The one advert I could find with a woman in a spacesuit, she was only in it because she's going to go to the moon and make it a cleaner place to live for all the men that are going to do the work. Such a wasted opportunity, really. Again, more subtle is where you get books like this, which are labeled as the boys' book of space. Space is for everybody. It's not just for boys. Now, everybody I know that's into astronomy is into astronomy probably because of Patrick Moore. He is hands down one of the best astronomy communicators that has ever actually lived, I think. He was amazing, but it's very well known that he didn't approve of women working in astronomy. And a lot of his books are very kind of centered towards the boys' book of something. As a child, I would have read this just to prove a point, but a lot of girls don't have the confidence to do that. And this is true whether it be toys, games, books. If it's labeled as boys or girls, the other sex won't dip into it. So it's actually very important that this stuff exists. In the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau commented, "Women do not possess sufficient precision and attention to succeed at the exact sciences." There are many women that have proved that's not the case. Quite often through history as well, women were certainly not allowed to log new discoveries. That had to come from a male. And also any sort of communication or correspondence that was going on often had to be addressed to the husband. Although when you look back through Caroline Herschel's memoirs and letters, people did write to her directly, but very often people were having to communicate via their husband because it just wasn't etiquette to be able to write directly to a female. Lunar craters, a lot of them are named. There are 1,605 named, and of those, only 29 are named after women, and many of them are on the far side. Thankfully, every crater on Venus is named after women, but we can't see those, obviously. One thing that I found out when I was doing some research when I took over the running of the UK Women in Astronomy Network is that there was a 11-to-1 disparity, male to female, working in senior roles at universities, in the top 12 universities in the UK for physics and astronomy. And I think it's got better with people at a less senior level, but there are some big issues around people kind of climbing the ladder, which I'll talk about towards the end. One thing that is a big problem, and it's a difficult one to fix, and that is unconscious bias. And the reason it's difficult to fix is the people that are guilty of it don't believe it's a thing because they've never been affected by it. But even back in the 1970s, Harvard realized there was a 4-to-1 ratio of men to women applying to study at Harvard. So they actually introduced a sex blind application process, and it came out 50-50. So this unconscious bias, giving people cutting them some slack. I don't think a lot of the time it's an overtly, I don't want women coming here doing this thing. It's more going with what you're familiar with. And that's certainly something that has come into play with this Hubble Space Telescope. The institute that run the booking for the Hubble Space Telescope actually have like a procedure where it's like applying for a grant. You have to submit a project proposal to get time on the telescope. And they did a study of a dozen or so review cycles at the turn of the century, and it showed that proposals led by male lead groups were much more successful. So rather than just going sex blind, they actually trialed a fully anonymous proposal. So people looking at the proposals didn't know which institute they came from. They didn't know whether it was a male or female lead. They didn't in fact know the names of anybody on the team. And when they trialed that, the outcome was in an even split. So both of these trials that I've just heard, and there've been many more in different institutes, but this just shows there is an unconscious bias there. And as I said, I think a lot of it is about, if you're going to give people time on the Hubble Space Telescope, you want to know that it's not going to be time wasted. It's such a precious resource. And you're going to know the male leads because they've had so many papers published more than the younger women that are coming through. So giving people, a bit of leeway there. I suspect it's just going with what you know. We all like what we're familiar with. Now, a lot of people always talk about Caroline Herschel as being the first female in astronomy. And I adore Caroline, taking nothing away from her. We are going to come to Caroline in a minute, well, in a few minutes. And I was actually astounded at how many women in astronomy came before Caroline. Now, she was the first to be paid for doing it, which was a game changer. So that's why she's just my heroine. I just adore her. But when I started doing research for the Yearbook of Astronomy article, suddenly the article that was going to be in one issue had to be split across 3 because I started to uncover some evidence of people working in astronomy way earlier in history than that. And the earliest I could find was going all the way back to Sumerian culture. And this is great because the Sumerians, it's the oldest known culture in Mesopotamia, but they communicated on these clay tablets. All their literature was basically on these clay tablets, and there's an abundance of that has survived. And so we know that these date back all the way back to 4300 BC. One of the things that we know by studying these, not me, because I can't read these hieroglyphs, it's like looking at a WhatsApp emoticon menu. Most of them are a mystery to me, but we do know from people that can read this stuff and study it that around about 2500 BC there were schools built that had male and female teachers that were teaching astronomy subjects. One of the women that was well known from that period is Enhedu Anna, and she was thought to have been born around about 2300 BC. And one of the things that they found within these clay tablets were these kind of calendars, and this was really important. Now, Enhedu Anna was the daughter of the Sargon of Akkad, and she actually was the chief astronomer priestess there. She was extremely well educated, and she was actually managing the entire temple complex within the city there. Now, within the Muslim culture in particular, the position of celestial bodies is very important. So calendar keeping was absolutely the bread and butter of most of the women that I'm talking about, kind of particularly pre-Caroline Herschel. So all of them really produced calendars and almanacs, and they would have had this sort of form. I don't know if this is a specific one that Enhedu Anna made herself, but this is the sort of thing that she would have produced. And she would have been following the moon and the stars and trying to more accurately predict where things were going to be and when, because obviously we're talking about a long time before the invention of telescopes here, and actually a long time before any portable astronomical instruments existed. So it was all naked eye stuff, and obviously involved lots of record keeping and people trying to do the maths on it. Another person that's still a long way back, but around about 1st to 3rd century BC, was Agalenice, or sometimes called Aganice of Thessaly. And she was thought to be the first female astronomer within the Western world. And when we do some digging with the stuff she did, one of the things that she did was very, very accurately predicting lunar eclipses. So she must have had a really good understanding and knowledge of Saros cycles, because she was able to do this. What we see in literature, though, is one of very, very many cases of where a female has achieved something good and then the male community writes something that is demeaning and kind of trying to undo that good. And one of the things here that we see is people writing that the moon obeys Agalenice, as if rather than her having the intellectual skill to do the maths and actually calculate this stuff, she has some kind of supernatural power and some control over the moon. If that feels subtle, the school that she ran for female astronomers were called the Witches of Thessaly, and there's no doubt there that that's an insult. And this is something that has happened all the way through history, and where I found things like that about particular people, I'm going to include it, because I think it's important that people see just what women have had to deal with throughout history, really. So yeah, I think it's really offensive that they would rather call these people witches than just accept that they had the nous to do the maths. I don't have the nous to do the maths to predict lunar eclipses, but equally I don't have any kind of supernatural power over the moon either. I just have stellarium. Another one that you may have heard of is Hepatia of Alexandria, and she was born around about 350 to 370 AD. And she was a mathematician and an astronomer from Egypt originally. And she kind of brushed shoulders with some very important people. She had a lot of influence over the political elite. And there were people, her dad was actually the head of a school, and she also taught at that school. And she did philosophy, astronomy, and her disciples or students included people that were very kind of senior aristocrats. So she was kind of friends with some pretty influential and famous people. And one of the things that you sometimes see about Hypatia is that she invented astrolabes. She didn't invent astrolabes. She is definitely known to have built them. If any of you do ever come to Oxford once the world opens up again, the Museum for the History of Science in Oxford has got the most exquisite collection of astrolabes, many of them coming from the Islamic world, and they are stunning. As I've said before, the position of celestial bodies was very important to the Muslim culture, so having good instruments to allow you to do measurements of that were really important. I'm very fortunate that I managed to get a private tour of that as part of a party with one of my friends who used to work there, and for her leaving party she wanted a private tour of there, and she invited me along, and I could have spent a week looking at those astrolabes. They're absolutely beautiful. So she definitely built them, and that's not an easy thing to build at all. Now Hypatia herself was actually pagan, but she was very tolerant of Christians, very tolerant of Muslims and any other religion at all. She was completely, open and worked with everybody. Everybody had a high opinion of her. And so she brushed shoulders with some very influential people. Now, inadvertently, she became a martyr for philosophy because she got embroiled in some political scandal where there was some huge scandal going on, and one party, I think, had seeked counsel with her. She got caught in the crossfire, and a mob of angry Christians murdered her in a very brutal and horrific manner, actually. And films have been made about this. I don't know how accurate they are to history. Equally, I have no idea whether she actually looked like this. This is a sketch of a bust that's been made of her. So whether this really bears any resemblance to what she looked like, who knows? But no, she was brutally murdered basically by this angry mob of Christians, which just shocked everybody because everybody just thought so highly of her. Now, inadvertently within the 20th century, she ended up becoming an icon for the women's rights movement and actually a precursor to the feminist movement as well. I don't know whether she would have liked that or not, but that's kind of what happened because of the manner that she was murdered. What's interesting to me is that the Christian martyr Saint Katharina is thought to be based on the life of Hypatia, and I find it quite kind of strange that the Christians would have a martyr based on the life of somebody that they themselves killed, but I don't know the ins and outs of that. But what I think is really awesome is that wherever I do get a lunar crater on the near side that is relevant to the lady I'm talking about. I'm going to show you a picture of it. If we go around the Theophilus trio, the bottom crater here is Katharina, named after the legend, but Hepatia also has one named after herself. So I think it's really funny that the mythical character that didn't actually exist gets the bigger crater, but hats off to Hepatia, she's inadvertently got 2 craters named after her, which I think is pretty awesome. And they're actually decent sized craters as well. They're pretty easy to spot with binoculars. So that's 2 for the price of 1 there for Hepatia. Now, during the Middle Ages, this was a really tough time, not just for astronomy, but science in general. And that is because anything that was seen heretical was destroyed. And that meant that in 400 AD, the Library of Alexandria was burned and so much knowledge was lost. And I think this is something we still find difficulty recovering from, because so often you talk to people and they just have this assumption that people in history didn't have the skill to do this thing or that thing. You very often hear that people in Egypt can't possibly have had the skill to build the pyramids. Yes, they could, but a lot of that skill was lost during the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages. And it's really offensive to me that people doubt the abilities of people throughout history. And it's because of things like this that knowledge was just lost, and it's taken decades, if not centuries, to rebuild that knowledge again. But as well as the burning of anything heretical, there was also a cultural shift that meant women were treated as second-class citizens, essentially. They were excluded from social society, they were excluded from cultural life, and had to behave a certain way, not be at gatherings, whatever. And I think that is something that we still are struggling to fully recover from, particularly in certain parts of the world. However, there were still women involved in science during the Dark Ages, which is fantastic, and we have some evidence of that. And a lot of them were scribes and teachers in monasteries and convents. And very often throughout history, when you talk about astronomy as well, you get this story about religion and astronomers kind of clashing. And that's mostly because of Galileo's story, which is quite often slightly misrepresented. Many of the people that taught a lot of astronomy were Jesuit priests, and they would go out and share this knowledge. So there wasn't quite this divide that people sometimes think there was during history. And a lot of the females were teaching in monasteries and convents there that were working within science. One of those who was a true polymath, and one of those people that legitimately deserves the genius label, and that's Hildegard von Bingen. She was a Benedictine abbess, but she was a writer and a composer, and a lot of people know her for her compositions, her really beautiful music. My stepson is studying music at Cambridge, and he's studied stuff by Hildegard, and people are still singing it today. Choral groups do still sing her music. She was also a philosopher and was actually the founder of scientific natural history in Germany, which is just amazing. She really was a true polymath. She was just so good at everything. And this picture here, I love this. I love the little Zoidberger dude that's coming down onto her head. And what's going on here is, as well as the scientific natural history that she did and the composing and the writing and all of that stuff, she also received these visions. And this picture in the Liber Scivias is showing her receiving one of these visions and dictating it to a scribe who looks like his head's kind of fallen off. I love these medieval paintings. I think they're awesome. But I've often wondered what the source of these actually these visions were. I get auras myself before I have non-epileptic seizures, and I wondered if it was that. I wondered if it was maybe migraine auras that you can sometimes get. And I actually found out the answer to this in the most unlikely place, and that is my husband gets a craft beer box occasionally, and with it is a brewing magazine. And there was an article last month about Hildegard. She was the first person ever that thought to put hops in beer. Whether that has any resemblance to what comes next is she suffered with migraines, and whether it was migraines caused by the hops in the beer, I guess we'll never know. But it was really interesting that she is actually known to have had migraines, and that was probably the source of these visions. How somebody would interpret these sorts of auras is kind of beyond me. You'd have to have a creative mind. For me, it's just random flashy stuff, and it kind of spins me out, but there's no way I could actually translate this into any form. But she was very well known for her visionary theology as well as her work on physics, and she wrote many books on visionary theology as well. I'd actually quite like to check some of those out sometime just to find out how she did interpret those visions. So yeah, that's what's going on here. This is her receiving a vision. It looks like Zoidberg or a ropey fly curtain or something, but so these pictures are awesome. Another lady who was living in Andalusia was Fatima of Madrid, and she was around the 10th, 11th century. And her dad was an astronomer, and he founded a school for maths and astronomy, and she helped him out there. One of the things that is a common feature throughout all of the women that I'm talking about here is that they had a male mentor of some form, and that was often a father or an uncle, a grandfather, and sometimes a family friend or whatever. They would quite often had to be taught at home because women were not allowed to get an education. And nearly all of these women that go back even beyond Caroline Herschel have got a male mentor that's kind of helping them out in some way with the education. But once they've done that, they're then going off and teaching themselves, which is great. Now, Fatima and her dad actually corrected the astronomical tables. And remember, we're still in a period here where there was no telescopes, and as the design of astrolabes, which is what Fatima's holding in this sketch, basically the measurements were going to get better and better with each generation of the astrolabe design and all of that kind of stuff. So calendars and tables of positions of celestial bodies were constantly being corrected and made better. And that's one of the things that Fatima and her father did. And Fatima actually published several books called The Corrections of Fatima, which were all about correcting incorrect astronomical tables. And it wasn't about the previous people being incompetent at all. It was just a limitation of what equipment they had. So she was clearly another, very, very well educated and very intelligent lady. Another picture here, this isn't astronomy particularly, but this is from the Principle of Euclid. It's an illustration from a medieval translation of this, which dates around about 1310. And it's depicting a female teaching geometry to a group of males. Looks like they're in a monastery. And I love these math sets. I still have them with the set squares and protractors and the stuff like that. I never had calipers though. But obviously, if somebody has gone to the trouble of making an illustration showing a lady teaching this stuff, there would have been more than one doing it. So it's really good to know that women were still kind of doing that kind of thing and doing what they loved during that awful period for science. During the Renaissance, women were kind of being included a bit more in stuff, and they were writing poetry, and also female interest in science started to increase, and also female interest in politics and music. Now, poetry, music, stuff like that, people thought were suitable for women, but very often just society in general would think that politics and science were just not something that women should be doing. But luckily they still did. And there was a big influx of women coming into science during the 16th and 17th centuries, when we had this huge revolution in science and loads of new discoveries and new inventions and all of that stuff. But at that time, women were still forbidden entry into universities, and not just that, they were not even allowed to go to the library in these places. And I'm going to talk about when education was permitted a bit later on, but they were basically relying on these male mentors in order to learn the stuff that they wanted to learn. So it would have, as I said, family, friends, any male relatives, people that had a good library at home where they could study from books and learn that way, because that was the only way they had. There was just no other option. Now, when we talk about brother-sister partnerships, you instantly think of the Herschels, but until I was researching for this article, I had no idea that Tycho Brahe also had a sister. And not only did he have a sister, but she was working with him in his observatory. And I had never heard of Sophia Brahe, and I've read a lot about Tycho. He's one of those fascinating characters from history that I would dearly love to spend some time with, because he sounds like a hoot, quite frankly. He was completely bonkers, and also a genius, and the last great naked eye astronomer. And I just had never ever seen a mention of Sophia anywhere. So Sophia was the youngest sister of Tycho Brahe, and they actually grew up in different houses, because Tycho, I think that's correct pronunciation rather than Tycho, but he basically had already left home and was doing his thing. So even though they were living in separate households, Sophia had this love of astronomy, and he helped her out and tried to teach her. And she was passionate from a really young age. And by the time she was 10, she was working in his observatory. It's difficult to imagine a 10-year-old working in an observatory. And I've seen pictures of Tycho's observatory in Denmark. I think it's a museum now, which I'd love to visit, because although telescopes hadn't been invented at this point, his observatory was like the most precision that stuff had been measured by for like ever. He just had all this incredible stuff that allowed him to really accurately measure the positions of the stars and the planets, and he really kind of changed the sky landscape, really, because it was the first time stuff had been done to that level of precision. And she was helping him with all of this, and I think that's great. Now, their parents obviously were not happy about Sophia doing this, but not only that, because they were a noble family, science and astronomy was felt inappropriate pastime for people of nobility to be getting involved with. And by the way, this dog is the creepiest dog I've ever seen. It's kind of got a human face on it. It's really scary. So yeah, they obviously had opposition from their parents, but they still carried on anyway. Now, Sophia really wanted to get an education, but there was no way that a female could go to a university at that time. So she basically was taught everything by her brother. And she used to calculate eclipses and cometary paths. And we quite often see Tycho as being credited with being the first person to really accurately measure the position of the planets, but it was Sophia that did that. And they were working together, but she was the one that was doing the measurement of the planets. And again, I'd never seen her credited with this work until I started digging for this book. As is common throughout history, even in the 1900s, if a woman was working, although she would have been doing it for free, anybody that was working, when they got married, the expectation was that they would stop and basically become have a life of domesticity. You'd be a housewife and a mother and all of that stuff, which is great, but it's really sad that these women were forced to choose. If they got married, they had to stop work. Now, unfortunately, her husband died when they were still quite young, but the plus side of that was it meant she could then go back and start working with Tycho again. So I think it's really important that we get Sophia's name known, because I'm somebody that has dug into women in astronomy for years, and I'd never heard of her. And she clearly made an important contribution to the science that we know and love today. Another lady from this sort of thought to be born around 1607 is Maria Kunis. She was born in Poland, and her dad actually taught her a lot of subjects, and she was another person that was really good at maths and astronomy and all of that stuff. And a family friend who was an amateur astronomer called Elias van Lowen taught her all this stuff about astronomy. Her dad had reached the point where he couldn't teach her anything else, so he enlisted the help of Elias. And this is the first of many examples where we see that the mentor and the mentee end up getting married. And initially you might think, oh, it's a bit creepy, but you know, on the flip side, it must have been so refreshing for men of that period. Women were expected to be kind of docile people, really, that hadn't got an education, and just, you know, you watch Pride and Prejudice, you can see the differences between the sisters, and this was the sort of thing that was expected. So when you get a male astronomer who meets a woman that is a good mathematician and has a love of the subject, of course they're going to have something in common and hit it off. That's what happened with me and my husband. So I think it is just a mutual love of astronomy that is going on here rather than anything else. Now, at this period in time, astronomical equipment was very, very expensive, and actually all the way through the 1900s and in the 1800s as well, astronomical equipment was vastly expensive. Most people had no chance of affording owning any of it, and particularly when telescopes were invented. And Maria Kunis had no good financial means behind her, so she was really hindered by a lack of good quality equipment. But instead of letting that stop her, she just got into mathematician mode, basically, and she did loads and loads of work, just all mathematical, theoretical stuff, which is amazing stuff. I could never do that. I can do some basic maths, but doing that kind of work is way beyond what I could do. And one of the things that she did quite famously is correcting errors in Kepler's tables. Now, Kepler was amazing, and obviously his tables were great, but there were errors in them, and she published her work correcting that. So we're talking about somebody here that had a lot of really good maths knowledge to have been able to do that. I really like this bronze statue of her. I think it's really, really beautiful, and that is sitting on a bench in Poland, which is lovely. I love this quote. I just find it's entertaining because this is an example of where men really can't get their head around the fact that women have stayed up all night observing. And this could so apply to me even today. Kunis was so deeply engaged in astronomical speculation that she neglected her household. The daylight hours she spent for the most part in bed, concerning which all manner of ridiculous events have been reported, because she had tired herself out from watching the stars at night. So not only are the men spinning out because she's actually having a nap during the day, having been up all night observing, the fact that they have to put this line about all manner of ridiculous events have been reported, again, it's this kind of early evidence of slut shaming, essentially, because she's in bed during the day, obviously something untoward is going on. And it's so offensive. To be honest, if I've been up all night observing, I am not going to get up at 7 o'clock to do the hoovering. My household is neglected if there's been a run of clear nights, because a girl needs to get some sleep at some point. And this is an interesting point because throughout a lot of history, women were not expected to work at night, even when they were becoming professionally paid astronomers. They were looking at plates and photographic film that were done by men the night before. It was just not expected at all that women would work at night. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Now, another person that, again, I love this story, and that's the one of Elizabetha Koopman Hevelius. She was born in 1647, and she, like all of these women, and like myself, loved astronomy from a very young age. Now, in her town was a guy called Johann Hevelius, who had been to law school and also had a family brewing business, which was of great success. Now, back then, water was filthy, so beer was basically clean water. So if you wanted to make yourself a millionaire, you brewed beer. And it wasn't the beer that we drink today. It was much lower alcohol percentage, but it was basically safer to drink than the water was. So if you wanted to get rich, just become a brewer, because everybody bought beer and drank that all the time. And he had a lot of money because of that, and he actually built himself a private observatory. When she was a young girl, she actually approached him to ask if he would teach her. She wanted to learn everything that she could and come and see the observatory, and he promised to show her the wonders of the heavens when she was older. And that is precisely what happened. She ended up going back to him again, age 15. So I don't know how old she was when she initially approached him, but she was very young and he thought she was too young. So when she was 15, he did accept her into the observatory and she began to learn from him. And they became an absolutely amazing husband-wife duo. Now, one of the things that Hevelius is famous for is building this incredible refractor, which gave 40 times magnification, which at the time was huge. When the telescope was invented, it was nothing like that. But this thing is amazing. It was 140 feet long, and there had to have all these guy ropes to stop the tube flexing. And I would just love to build one and look through it to see what it was like, because this is crazy. Imagine just popping one of these up in your back garden. I mean, no wonder there are crowds around it looking at it. It's just absolutely extraordinary, and a Black & Decker workmate to hold the bottom of it down. But he was quite famous for this, so he was kind of a well-known guy within the town. And I love this quote from E.F. McPike. And when in the starlit night she followed with enraptured gaze and beating heart through his giant telescope the shining full moon on her silent path, she exclaimed with enthusiasm, to remain here and gaze always, to be allowed to explore and proclaim with you the wonder of the heavens, that would make me perfectly happy. And the worthy man felt it might make him happy too. I will never forget my 11th birthday getting my first ever telescope, and pointing it at a moon that was nearly full, and that kind of gasp the first time you see a moon that way, it's just extraordinary. And for this young girl to finally, having for years pestered this guy to teach her, to look through one of his telescopes and see the moon like that must have been such an amazing moment for her. And I still get that when I look through the telescope at a moon when I'm not busy imaging or whatever, it still fills me with that kind of awe. And I can only imagine what it must have been like for her, because obviously telescopes and zoom lenses are 10 a penny now, and I still get affected by that. And when she was 16, she did end up marrying him. They had quite a big age gap, but she became his assistant, probably unpaid. But yeah, they were doing a lot of work together, doing lots and lots of stuff. And no, it was an amazing husband-wife partnership. But as well as helping him and being an assistant, she did lots of her own observations. And that's the case for lots of these women. They may have been an assistant to their husband or some other family member, but almost all of them were doing their own work as well as that. And she did a lot of very important maths calculations. She's clearly a very intelligent lady. Now, when her husband died, it was inevitable that she was probably going to outlive him with that age gap. She actually prepared 3 books of his for publication with all of his work in it. And it is thought that a significant portion of that work was done by her, even though it was published under his name. So yeah, hats off to her. They were an amazing couple. Another lady from around the 1600s, born in 1670, is Maria Marguerite Winkelmann Kirsch, and she was born in Germany. And luckily for her, her father and uncle were big advocates for equality with regards to education for women. So all of the children were educated, and she was educated by both of them. Now, she ended up becoming an apprentice of a guy called Christopher Arnold, who was a local astronomer, a local amateur astronomer. And through him, she met, he was the Brian Cox of the day. This was Gottfried Kirch, and he was very, very well known, famous astronomer. And they met, and they ended up getting married. And he was working at the Berlin Academy of Sciences and running the observatory there, and she became his assistant, again probably for no money, but she was working there with him. And actually they did so much work together, as with all of them, doing calendars, almanacs, and eclipse predictions, planetary positions, all of the bread and butter stuff that astronomers were doing. So they did all of that stuff. And while she was working there, she became the first woman to discover a comet. And the reason it's credited to Gottfried, it was definitely her that discovered it, but women were just not allowed to make discoveries then. So if you read the blurbs, it definitely says that he himself didn't find the comet, but it is credited to him. So this is why we very often don't see her name in the history books as being the first woman to discover a comet. Now, she worked at this place for a number of years with him and was held in extremely high esteem. But when he died, the Academy cut her loose. They would not let her stay working there. They feared she would set a bad example. This story annoys me beyond belief. She'd already proved herself capable of the work, but they were just having none of it. What bad example she was going to set, I just don't know, because although she didn't obviously have a university education, because no woman did, she could do the work and had already proven this. Now, she had children at that time and begged them to let her young son take over in the job that his dad had had so she could continue working as the assistant. Absolutely having none of it. And when her children got older, she fought to get them into the academy, and eventually her son was accepted, but her daughters were not. They wouldn't let the women in at all. And I think this is really, really appalling. And poor Maria, she loved astronomy, was very good at astronomy, and she did go off and get work in some other private observatories. But in the end, she had to give up because the sexism was just so bad, and she was just having such bad experiences that she had to give up working in astronomy altogether. And, you know, every time I think about this, I just get so angry on her behalf because, you know, okay, I understand somebody not wanting to give a woman a chance who's never worked there before, but when you've done a job for years and been good at it, there's no need to have behaved like that. And I think it's awful. Another amazing lady who I personally really love, as you'll see in why in a second, is Maria Clara Imar. She was born in 1676, and another profession around that time that was very lucrative was being an engraver and a painter. And George Christoph Imar, her dad, was that. And he actually taught her, she became an apprentice to him, and he taught her engraving and painting. And say lots of people needed signs painting and things engraved with names and inscriptions and stuff. So he had the means to build himself a private observatory. Now, he funded this private observatory and she became his apprentice there, but he'd also taught her the art side of things, and she put the two together and became really well known for her eyepiece sketches. She did pastel sketches at the eyepiece, but also engravings of astronomical things. And she ended up marrying a guy called Johann Heinrich Müller, and she inspired her husband to get into astronomy. So I think that's really awesome that everybody, when I've been into astronomy my whole life, when Mark and I got together, people that knew me through Mark were like, oh, did you get into astronomy because of Mark? And it's like, no. And so I think it's really good that she inspired her husband to get into the subject. But one of her sketches are just exquisite, and just go and Google her afterwards. Her stuff is beautiful. One of the things that she did was these incredibly detailed lunar sketches at all different phases. As we all know, if you're going to get some detail of the topography of the moon, you don't do it when it's fully illuminated, you do it when the terminator is nearby. And she did that over and over again at different librations, all lunar phases, and her sketches were so detailed that the very first topographical map that they produced of the lunar landscape was done based on her sketches. They were that good. I mean, looking at these now, you can see just at a glance how accurate they are. They're absolutely beautiful. They're more accurate than my sketches, that's for sure. And I actually really want to get some blue paper, because I think the sketches look gorgeous on there. But she didn't just do the moon either. She did the way that Saturn looked during different apparitions. And one of the things somebody commented last time I did this talk that I hadn't thought about is that one of the things that Maria has done here is drawn what she's seen, not what she thinks she should see. And that is a very difficult thing to do as an artist. And people by this point had kind of seen that Saturn had rings. So why would you draw it looking like this? And this is just because atmospheric disturbances are causing it, and it looks very, very different at different times, and that's the case now. And she was drawing that exactly as it was seen through the eyepiece. In addition to that, she did Venus's phases as well, but also comets. There was a lot of stuff throughout history where people didn't really know whether comets had any impact on the world, and people were studying comet forms and tail shapes and lengths to see whether they linked in with any natural disasters. And one of the things that she did was a lot of very accurate cometary sketches, and I think these on the blue background are just so pretty. This is just a piece of me, blue and gold. I'm just all over anything celestial in those colors. So I took my sketch of Comet Neowise and inverted it and put it on a blue background, just as a nod to Maria Clara Imart. And you saw last time I did the talk for you, these are some of my pastel sketches. I really hope that the people that were doing sketching back then kind of appreciate the fact that we're still keeping this going. And actually, I've just taken on the Fireball challenge with the UK Meteor Network, and I've challenged myself to do an astronomy sketch every day for 2 months. And the hope is that I will develop a freer, faster, looser technique that doesn't necessarily have to be photo accurate. And hopefully I will find that very enjoyable. But no, I hope Maria Clara Imart is happy that she's still inspiring people to do this stuff to this day. Now we come on to Caroline, and as I said, if I could have a time machine and had to pick just one person throughout history to spend some time with, it would be Caroline Herschel. I've just finished reading her memoirs and correspondence, and I can't recommend this book highly enough. It gave me such an insight into the woman. I've always kind of had a sense of that quick wit that she had. She's hilarious. She's just so funny, and I really enjoyed that book immensely. Now, Caroline was the youngest of 8 children, and actually she got her love of astronomy from her father. Yes, William, we all know that he rescued her from the Cinderella life and all of that, but actually her dad had an interest in astronomy, and it was her dad that kind of initially sparked that interest for her. Now, Caroline had a really tough start to life. She contracted typhus when she was 10 and it stunted her growth, so she only ever grew to be 4'3". She'd also had, I think it was smallpox, and it scarred one of her eyes, so she had very little vision in one of her eyes, and also had some facial marks from the smallpox as well. And because of these things being considered disfigurements, which I think is horrendous, but that's what the family thought, they all assumed that she would never get married. So they basically, she was invisible to them. William is the only person in her memoirs after her dad had died that ever even noticed that she was in a room. There was one really sad story that I read in Comet Sweeper where she was supposed to have gone to meet William when he came back from a trip somewhere, and they'd crossed over somewhere, and she waited and waited and waited, and the family were halfway through dinner and no one had even noticed she hadn't come home. And that just breaks my heart. And I just kind of want to take how much we love Caroline and rub it in her mum's face, because her mum hated her getting any form of education, because she basically, her dad was teaching her stuff, but her mother firmly disapproved of this. She didn't want Caroline learning anything that would make her useful to anybody else, because then she could go off and get a job and then she would lose her free house servant. That's what it came down to. And she loved her father dearly, but her mum just did everything she could to try and prevent that education from happening. And when her father died, William and Alexander were working away and they did get her out of that situation. But her dad was the one that encouraged her to study the night sky initially, and he took her out, showed her constellations and showed her a comet, which was obviously going to have an effect on her given how many comets that she went on to discover. And also she's got a very vivid recollection of when she was 14, her dad dragged the whole family out and gathered them round a bathtub full of water, and then they observed a solar eclipse in the reflected water. So that is something that had a lasting impact on her as well. Now, William and Alexander were working in Bath, and William, very accomplished musician, so was their dad, and William was teaching but also performing. And they had this idea that William saw something in Caroline and wanted to get her out of that situation. And quite often this story is told, but actually she went from being one housekeeper to another. And another thing that comes up over and over again in her memoirs is this frustration that William was supposed to be teaching her this musical stuff so she could go off and have this musical career with him, but he didn't have time to do it. So she was having to self-teach, and her other brothers were vile to her. They would make sure that she had no free time whatsoever to do this and would mock her if she did it when they were in the house, and it was really tough for her. She ended up kind of teaching it herself, and when she went off to Bath, she ended up having a very successful career as a singer, which is phenomenal. But by that time William was into astronomy and again was not giving her the support that he said that he was going to be doing. So although he did definitely save her from the Cinderella life, she was still a housekeeper. She did all the bookkeeping and all of that stuff when she first moved there, and actually there's a lot of frustration in her life that she felt like she was constantly being held back. But once William became obsessed with astronomy, they used to have these conversations about it over the breakfast table, and Caroline got interested in it as well and fell into being his assistant. But as well as being his assistant, and she was a very, very attentive assistant, she actually became a fantastic astronomer in her own right. But she didn't just do observing, she would grind and polish mirrors, and mirrors back then were made of speculum, and they tarnished really quickly. So every one of their big telescopes would have 2 or 3 mirrors that they would interchange all the time. So she would be doing that. She'd be building mounts. She was also recording William's observations so that he could sit at the eyepiece and not get disturbed. So she'd write all that stuff down. She would actually plan the observing for the next night if it was clear, and then she would write up all of the notes the next day. So she was kind of full-time job being William's assistant, but every time she wasn't required by William, she would go off and do stuff with her own sweeper, her own telescope that she called the sweeper, just sweeping the skies looking for new discoveries. And I can't find anybody in history that's worked harder than she did. She never stopped. Now, she made her first discovery in 1738, and that was what we now know as Messier 110. She went on to discover 8 comets herself, as well as other things as well. Now, she became the first woman in the history of science to be paid for her work, and that came about because the King of Denmark had kind of got William to do something for him. He had commissioned him to do some astronomical work, and he knew that Caroline was working very hard and actually factored in a salary so Caroline would get paid. And all she ever wanted really was to become an independent person, and eventually she did get that. But it's a really weird dichotomy, because on the one hand she just wanted to serve William. He was the one that saved her from that other life, and first and foremost she wanted to serve William. And it was quite interesting. Now, she started when William died. She didn't think she'd live the year. She was absolutely grief-stricken, and she moved back to Hanover and then lived for nearly 30 more years, but couldn't do any observing there at all. But she was still writing up stuff. She'd done all this work to make Flamstead's star catalogue more accessible, and she just never stopped working right the way through to the end. And she started getting, like, she got the gold medal for the RAS, and she ended up being the first honorary members of the RAS, and she also got a gold medal for science from the King of Prussia, and a whole other list of accolades that came to her. She did not feel that she was worthy of any one of them, and that makes me so sad. She was just phenomenal, and basically she couldn't cope with anybody saying she did something good, because she felt it meant that William hadn't done a good job. And it's like, girl, you can both be good. It's okay. There's enough good for both of you. And I wish that she could just see herself the way that we see her now. And honestly, when I got to the end of her letters, I knew she was going to die soon, and I just sobbed for 20 solid minutes. And yeah, she was just a phenomenal lady. Now, she does have a lunar crater named after her, and it's a relatively easy one to find. It's up near Sinus Iridum, this one here, which is a fairly nice one. Now, this is a picture we see of the two of them very often, and there are times where William was so tunnel visioned that he would sit at a telescope eyepiece for hours and hours and hours without eating and drinking, and she would take food to him and put it in his mouth and take drinks to him. But seeing this portrait, I don't know who commissioned this or what purpose it was for, but this annoys me beyond belief, because William's polishing a mirror and she's just giving him a cup of tea, and it's kind of like she was more than that. Also looks like she's taller than William as well, which there was no need to do. But when William died, there was a lot of obviously amazing obituaries, because the whole Herschel family were phenomenal astronomers and did so much good work. And there's a lot of good things said about Caroline there, but also nobody can compliment a woman for anything in history without taking it away with the other hand. So he was assisted in his observations by his excellent sister with indefatigable and unhesitating devotion in the performance of a task usually deemed incompatible with female habits. That is just not the case. If you give women a chance, they will prove that they're more than capable of getting their heads down and doing the work. I like this picture better because it shows her sat doing some actual observations with him. But the president of the Royal Society said that Caroline had advanced the science she cultivated with so much success through perseverance, stoicism, and importantly through ambition and a lifelong desire for independence. And that's what she wanted. She wanted to be an independent lady. I think it's very sad that she didn't get married, because she would have been a really phenomenal partner in life. Now, when we move into the 1800s, I'm going to talk about a couple of women from this period, because predominantly this talk is about people pre-Caroline, but there are some I just have to talk about with respect to the whole landscape. But in the 1800s, women were still forbidden from using libraries, and that's because male classicists feared women would be corrupted by the shocking stories and filthy words. I used to have a Saturday job in my mum's factory in Lancashire. I can tell you, we can deal with the filthy words. I heard a lot of them. We're good. We can take it. Now, Cheltenham Ladies College did teach physics and astronomy, but women were still not allowed to graduate until the women's colleges were built in London and also at Oxford University. Bedford College was the first one, Lady Margaret Hall after that, and then St Hilda's at Oxford after that as well. But even when those undergraduate schools for women were built, it was still a long time before women were actually allowed to graduate. So this is Bedford College, very grand building, founded in 1849 by Elizabetha. Elizabeth Jesser, and this is Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, founded in 1878. Now, the Edinburgh Seven were the first female matriculated undergraduate women to study at any British uni. They were actually at a medical school at Edinburgh University, so they were not astronomers, but even though they'd gone through the entire medical school course, they were not allowed to graduate or qualify as doctors. How driven do you have to be to go through med school and at the end of it not actually have a qualification or be able to probably get a job even? I really, hats off to these women, because I don't think I could have done that. Lady Margaret Hall was the first college at Oxford University to admit women, but it wasn't until 1920 that women could graduate from Oxford Uni. In 1880, 4 women did graduate in the UK for the first time at a university in London, but it wasn't an astronomy thing. But this is a really important point here. In order for a woman to attend these colleges, they needed financial backing from their family. This education was expensive. And not only that, once the family had paid for this woman to go through school, at the end of it, they're going to need to understand that this female might want something beyond a life of domesticity. And it's a really important fact. A lot of women that go through all this hard work might not want to give up work when they get married, and their family needed to kind of understand that. And the financial aspect alone was prohibitive for very many women. And, you know, it's a real shame. But by the late 1800s, women were starting to get employed professionally. And this was a time where the Harvard computers were born. And also we had the Greenwich Lady computers in London. And this coincided with women getting jobs as typists, switchboard operators, watch painting, and other kind of jobs that were delicate and didn't require physical strength. So it's really good that women were kind of proving that they could actually hold down jobs in the workplace and actually add value, that there was stuff that they could do and do well. Now, these jobs were considered by the community to be ladylike, but also ideally suited to the essentially docile female mind and temperament. Why can we not just be happy that these women have got jobs? Why do we have to say, yeah, well, that suits a woman because she's got a docile mind and temperament? It's just so offensive. And I beg to differ. If you see the old video footage of switchboard operators, I don't think that doing all of the plugging stuff in would have worked if you had a docile mind and temperament. So it really does irk me that throughout history, whenever something good has happened, somebody has to kind of take it away again. Now, a lot of the women doing these jobs, as I said earlier, would have been working in the daytime. So in terms of astronomy, they would have been looking at photographic plates and spectra and all of that kind of thing. They were not expected to work at night. And actually, even through into the 1950s, famously, Vera Rubin initially was not allowed to work in the observatory that she got the job at. Women were just not allowed in the observatories at all. Oh, it's because we only have a gents' toilet. No, it isn't. It's because you're sexist and you don't want women near the telescopes. So the women were doing stuff that kind of involved analysis the day after, for the most part. Caroline was the first professional woman that was paid that was actually observing at night. Now, Maria Mitchell is one of the key players in this sort of 1800s landscape, and she was born in Nantucket to a Quaker community, and her dad was a teacher and an amateur astronomer, and the whole kind of Quaker ethos was about equality for everybody. So they basically had this, everybody was taught equally, everybody had the same opportunities, and that's really good. So Maria Mitchell got a really good education from her dad, who was an amateur astronomer himself. And when she was 12, she was helping him calculate the exact time of a solar eclipse. So it's like, wow, the math skill that these people had was extraordinary. And she actually opened her own school in 1835, which was great. Now, she always described herself as having a normal level of activity but extraordinary patience, and I think that must be the case for all of these women that were working then. Now, Maria Mitchell discovered a comet in 1847, which is great. She was also the first woman to enter the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the first woman to enter the American Association for the Advancement of Science as well. So these were important places for women to be admitted to, and it really helped kind of build on the women getting educated type of thing. Now, she became a professor of astronomy at Vassar and also the director of the observatory. So she was teaching and doing research, which is phenomenal. The first female professor of astronomy that I'm aware of. She was obviously paid way lower a wage than the men were, but at least she was getting paid and doing the job, which is great. Now, she founded the Association for the Advancement of Women, which is really good and was very important around that time. Her crater is this little tiny one up here. That's crater M. Mitchell. Elizabeth Brown is another kind of important person from this period, and her dad was also a keen astronomer and probably taught her, and Elizabeth became a keen assistant. Now, he was also into weather observations and meteorology, and she helped him with astronomy and meteorology. And she was one of the first women to own an observatory, and definitely the first woman that was ever photographed in one. So this is her. I can't imagine the excitement for this woman. I know how excited I was when we built our observatory, and that was kind of 6 years ago. And so for a lady in this period to actually have her own observatory, the pride must have just been immense for them. She concentrated on solar observing and eclipse chasing, which was a common thing for a lot of women of the time, which I find quite extraordinary in many ways, which I'll talk about in a second. But in 1893, she was the first woman to be elected as a fellow of the Royal Meteorological Society, which is phenomenal. She stated that many ladies have ample time at their disposal and are often skilled with the use of a pencil, so we can put that to good use and start doing some eyepiece sketches, which is fair enough. A lot of women are good with the pencil, but she herself said that the sun is a suitable subject for female study because it can be undertaken in the daytime and necessitated no exposure to the night air, which Victorians regarded as being dangerous to the delicate female constitution. And I find this really hilarious. Eclipse chasers, a lot of eclipse chasers were female. Now, global travel in the 1800s was not a safe undertaking at all. You didn't know what kind of storm systems you might hit. There were tropical diseases and almost no protection or treatment against those. There would have been potential hostile attack from locals. You just suddenly rock up to some random island in the middle of the Pacific or wherever you're off to. You could get embroiled in local political battles. You know, who knows what you're going to face when you go out there. And like, surely that is far more dangerous than being out on a chilly night in an English garden. And Alan Chapman makes this point in one of his books that I've read. I find it really interesting that people think that a chilly night is more dangerous than global travel like this. Just extraordinary. I've included this picture again. I think I showed it in my astronomy sketching talk, but Mary Proctor was another eclipse chaser, and this was the 1896 Norway eclipse. And when I posted my photograph from Glendo State Park, when we did the, I did a sketch of the lunar eclipse that we saw in 2017, and somebody emailed this photograph to me and said, can you see the similarities? And yes, I was just so chuffed that I'd never heard of Mary Proctor before. I can't remember who sent me the email, but I'm so grateful that they did, because this is another female from history that is now on my radar. And the similarities between these two sketches are immense. And yes, I cheated and did mine from a photograph, but you know, the intent was there. Now, another really important lady from this period as well was born in Oxford, not far from me, and that was Elizabeth Isis Pogson. And her dad was actually the director of the Radcliffe Observatory in Oxford. And her dad ended up moving. He got appointed as the head of the Madras Observatory, so they moved to India. And this is the Madras Observatory. And she ended up becoming his salaried assistant. She was paid a servant's wage, but she was paid to be his assistant there, which is great. And when her dad died, she was actually appointed director in his place. So this is a very different experience from what we've seen previously, where people get kicked out because the whoever they're serving has died. So at least they gave her a chance, and she ended up becoming in charge of that. Now, she was actually the first woman to single-handedly head up a government scientific research station. So that's quite an achievement. Now, famously, she was refused when she was nominated as a fellow with the Royal Astronomical Society in 1886, but was eventually elected in 1920. And I'm going to talk about the reasons for that in a second. And another lady from this period as well that is worthy of mention is Wilhelmina Patton Stevens Fleming. And I love her story so much. She was born in 1857 in Dundee, but she emigrated with her husband and they would move to Boston when she was just 21 years old. And when they got there, her husband ended up abandoning her and her young child. So she had to find work to make ends meet. And she ended up getting a job for Professor Edward Charles Pickering, who was the director of Harvard College Observatory. And this was a real stroke of luck for her because he would often complain about his staff saying, my Scottish maid could do better. And in the end, he gave her a job. He got her in to do some admin initially, but then she formally joined the observatory and started working as an astronomer there. And that's amazing. And he taught her to analyze stellar spectra. As I said, these would have been captured the night before by the men there, and then she was doing the analysis, and she became the founding member of the Harvard computers. So this was where women were employed to do calculations. We didn't have calculators then, we didn't have computers then, so these women would sit and work through these mathematical calculations, and this was something that women were more than capable of doing, and they did get the chance to do that. But this is an amazing achievement, and yet again they were labeled as Pickering's harem, and this is a common thing. And actually women that work in kind of young women in their career now, there's a cosmologist that I follow in America, the amount of kind of sexist stuff that she gets is just unbelievable, and just labeling them as a harem rather than just saying well done, you're doing some great maths there, really annoying. But anyway, she actually worked on these spectra and actually came up with the stellar classification system that we still use today. So she did some really important work. She discovered many gaseous nebulae, 300 variable stars, some novae, and actually the first white dwarf star. And her most notable discovery was the Horsehead Nebula, and this is my sketch of that. Also working for the Harvard computers was Henrietta Swan Leavitt, and she was born in Massachusetts and actually did get a degree in 1892. She began working as a Harvard computer, but what she was doing was measuring stellar magnitudes, and it was actually Henrietta Swan Leavitt that discovered the period luminosity relationship of Cepheid variables. And if any of you guys know anything about cosmology, you'll know that we would be nowhere without this knowledge and this use of standard candles, as they're called. Now, when this work was published, because still women were not allowed to publish work like this, it had to be in his name. But he very, very clearly states that it was her work when you actually read the stuff. So in the late 1800s, we had the rise of the Astronomical Societies, as well as women starting to work as computers. And the oldest of that is Liverpool AS. And members were very often professional women, and they would travel quite big distances to actually come to the Astronomical Society meetings. And way back in the late 1800s, we're looking at kind of 10–20% membership female, which is really good. Now, the BAA was actually founded partly by Elizabeth Brown, who I showed you the photograph of earlier in her observatory. And from the get-go, women were admitted, and they've been on the governing council, and there have been women directors of each section from the beginning, which is amazing. So they're a very female-friendly society. So I was quite astonished when I was asked to do the, astonished I was asked. I did the Sky Notes presentation for their January meeting in 2020, which, you know, was a great honor, but I found out that I was the first female that had ever done a Sky Notes presentation for the BAA. I was thinking, why is that? Because I know so many female speakers that would be more than capable of doing that. And while I'm truly honored that my name will go down as that, I find it extraordinary that more women haven't been included in that aspect of the meetings. But you know, the women are heavily involved, and they are definitely a very female friendly society from my experience, so that is good. Now, to put some context here, the Harvard computers were working 7-hour days, 6 days a week, and getting paid about 25 cents an hour. The Greenwich Lady Computers in London were doing a similar thing, but employed by Astronomer Royal, so William Christie, and he employed these lady computers who were graduates. So they're going to have had professional aspirations. They're going to have needed to have had a family that have paid for this education, very expensive education, and they were working alongside boys that came straight from school with no qualifications at all for just £4 a month. And this is really unfair. To make a female have to get a job here is going to have gone through one of these very expensive undergraduate courses. That means straight away anybody that doesn't have a wealthy parent is not going to be able to get a job as the computer. And the fact they're doing it alongside men that haven't got any qualifications is just so unfair, and say for repentance as well. To give him his due, Christie did try to improve that for them, but there are many women astronomers in the 1800s that were approached to work as a Greenwich Lady Computer, and they turned it down because it was demeaning. They were having to jump through all these hoops and get paid a really low wage for some very important work. So there lots of people just said, no thanks, I'm not doing it. And I don't blame them, to be honest. Now, I was reading, I like Alan Chapman's books on the history of astronomy, and there was one I was reading, this lady called Annie Walker from Cambridge, not the Rover's Return landlady, but she was age 15, got a job at the University Observatory as a junior assistant, and over the next decade ended up getting promoted, and her salary increased from £40 to £100 a year. And that meant that she was getting paid the same as a man for a similar job, which is amazing, because at the time she then became the most senior and most well-paid female astronomer in history. And again, without reading Alan Chapman's book, this lady is somebody I would never have heard of. So difficult to delve into the records for this stuff sometimes. She is also thought to be only the second professional astronomer that worked at night. Now, as we saw pre-Caroline Herschel, loads of them were doing nighttime work, but the people that were actually formally employed, she's only the second one after Caroline Herschel that worked at night. So that's great. Now, I added this slide in because Carolyn Shoemaker is an absolute living legend. This is Carolyn Shoemaker, as in Shoemaker Levy 9 fame. And on Comet Watch that I co-host, we actually had Carolyn Shoemaker as a guest, and I've never been more starstruck in my entire life. She was an absolute joy to talk to. She only started her professional career in astronomy age 51. She was a housewife, and when the kids grew up, she had big time empty nest syndrome. Her husband, Eugene Shoemaker, was a planetary scientist and geologist, and she had never had much interest in those subjects, but the way that he explained them she found really interesting. So she said to him, I'm really bored, I need to do something, do you have anything that I can do? So he taught her how to use the spectrograms and basically look at slides to look for near-Earth asteroids, dwarf planets and comets, and that's what she did, and she was very good at it. And she is obviously most famous for Shoemaker Levy 9, which impacted Jupiter in 1994, but she discovered 32 comets and 377 minor planets, but also somewhere in the region of 700 asteroids as well. I don't know where the minor planet asteroid boundary is, but she discovered a lot of stuff in her career, and say she only started age 51. And what an utter joy this lady was to talk to. She was just, I was so emotional afterwards. She once held the record for the most number of comet discoveries by an individual person. That's obviously Rob McNaught has blown that out of the water, but she's just an absolute joy, and she is a living legend, nearly 92 now. And yeah, I've got the link for the show on YouTube, which I'll send to you. Now, I mentioned earlier on about the Royal Astronomical Society rejecting Isis Pogson nominee for being a fellow, and her daddy basically put her forward for this, and she was turned down. And the reason she was turned down wasn't because they outwardly just didn't want her in the society. It was due to a legal quibble over a male pronoun. And this raises the issue that this isn't a PC gone mad thing. Male pronouns can be very, very damaging. And just the name fellow implies male straight away. And the legal founding charter meant that meant only men were allowed. And one of the things they did a secret ballot in 1892 to try and get a feel for how many people were going to be okay with the idea of letting women become fellows. And it failed to get the majority needed to allow women to enter. And one of the guys that was polled on this was John Brett, and he said it was practically a proposal to introduce into these dull meetings a social element, and all we shall require is a piano and a fiddle and lay down some parquet flooring, and I'm sure many of my young friends will be glad to dance through most of the papers. Sorry, mate, most of these women probably don't want to dance with you because you sound like a knobber. It's just appalling. This was the kind of thing that people were facing. Luckily, that did change in 1916. The rules did change, and she was elected a fellow in 1920. So luckily that all came good. But this is honestly, the fact that he said this publicly is just extraordinary to me. Now, Cambridge University was the last university to allow women to take full degrees, and that wasn't until 1947. In 1975, the Sex Discrimination Act was passed, which helped change quite a lot of things with regard to education. But Oxford University, Queen's College, is where my husband did all his undergrad and postgraduate study. And women were not allowed to join Queen's College at Oxford until 1979. That's not that long ago. I was 6 at that point and already loving astronomy. And the thought that a 6-year-old me would have found out that Oxford University College wouldn't allow me to study there when I got older because I'm a female. This is really shocking. It's really not that long ago. Now, we all love Jocelyn Bell Burnell. She is another absolute living hero, and she did a talk for Oxford University Physics Department talking about challenges that she's experienced in her career. I've got a link to that, which I'll put in the chat at the end as well. I please urge you to go and watch this because it's utterly heartbreaking in places. One of the things that she had to put up with is she was the only female in a class of 50 men in her honours physics class. And there was a tradition at Glasgow Uni that every time a female entered a lecture room, people would catcall, stamp their feet, bang their desks. It was just really, really demeaning. And most of the women on courses would congregate outside and walk in together because it was very humiliating for this to happen to a female on their own. But obviously everyone assumed she was going to change subject, and thankfully for all of us, she didn't. But other things that she talked about as well was when she discovered pulsars, she built the telescope, she made the discovery. But obviously this was a huge discovery, a lot of press interest, and the press would talk to her supervisor, Anthony Hewish, and he would talk about all the technical stuff. When they got to her, they would ask her what her bra, waist, hip size was. Did she have a bigger waist than Princess Margaret or a thinner one? And kind of personal questions like that. And then when it came to the photographs, they were asking her to unbutton her shirt all the way down for a better picture. And no, this is late 60s, right? This is not that long ago, and they were that outwardly appalling to her. And also when she made that discovery, other people in the department were kind of like, whatever. When she got engaged, everyone was congratulating her and just assumed she would give up working there. Oh, obviously she didn't do. And so we're not talking about that far back in history here. There's a lot of stuff she talks about here that is really worth a watch, so I'll stick the link in. And this leads me on to something called the Matilda Effect, and this is a bias where against acknowledging the achievements of women, basically. So the work that they've done is attributed to male colleagues, and there are lots of experiences of this, not just in astronomy but in science in general throughout history. Examples, there's a lady called Nicole-Rienne Table de la Brie-Lepete. That's a hell of a name. She was one of the people, she was working with a guy called Alexis Clairaut, and one of the things they were doing was working on an astronomical clock, a very complicated clock that had an astronomical function to it. But she also worked on the calculations that were going to predict the return of Halley's Comet, Halley, sorry, we've been saying it wrong all these years. And basically he completely failed to recognize that her contribution. They did recover the comet thanks to those calculations, and no recognition for her contribution to that at all. Another example is Cecilia Payne, and when she submitted her doctoral thesis, one of the examiners said that this was undoubtedly the most brilliant thesis ever written in astronomy. This was in 1925. One of the things that she concluded in that thesis is that the sun was composed of 99% hydrogen. We just know this as a common fact now, this was completely new science. And Henry Norris Russell was her supervisor. He persuaded her to remove that conclusion from her thesis. Then a few years later, wrote it up and claimed that discovery for himself. Absolutely despicable, really annoying. And also Jocelyn Bell Burnell, it's quite famous that she discovered pulsars in 67, but this was labelled as one of the most significant achievements of the 20th century, but her supervisor got the Nobel Prize for that. She wasn't credited at all with it. Now, there are only about 3 or 4 women in history that have had a Nobel Prize in physics, so it's very hard to gauge what the norm is. It's quite often just said that that was etiquette, and I certainly found out that the guy that discovered insulin was a PhD student and his supervisor got the Nobel Prize for it, and his supervisor was so annoyed he split the prize money with the guy. I mean, insulin, obviously the discovery of that meant that we've had many lives saved from people with diabetes that would have died otherwise. So that was really important. But then I've also found other PhD students that did get the Nobel Prize, but it's really hard to kind of gauge what the norm is when so few women have got physics Nobel Prizes. But she takes this with great faith. She's absolutely fine with it, and quite famously said that she wouldn't have got all these other awards if she'd been given a Nobel Prize that early in her career. Now, Tim Peake, I love him, and the outreach that's gone on with schools since he went to the space station has been phenomenal. But I remember seeing this online, the first Brit in space, Tim Peake. I think this person would have something to say about that, because Helen Sharman spent 8 days in space in May 1991. And I think it's quite entertaining that just last year, The Guardian and Observer posted another article talking about the women in the space industry that have basically been forgotten. It's like, yes, by you wiped her name out completely from history by publishing that Tim Peake was the first man. So Helen Sharman wasn't just the first female into space, she was the first Brit into space, full stop. So let's not forget that she did that. So in terms of how the UK compare with the rest of the world, the IAU is the body that many professional astronomers join. And in terms of female membership, the UK are not doing that well. The world average is 19%. We are joint second to last place with just 13% female membership. And this is a really tough thing to fix. The Netherlands have taken the decision that they're just going to give female-only application rules for certain roles to just get more women in the department to begin with. But, you know, it's a very tough thing to fix. I personally don't think positive discrimination is necessarily the answer, because there's always that question, did you get that talk request because you're a female, or did you get it because people like your talks? Did you get the job because you're a girl and it's a box ticking exercise, or did you get it because on your merit? And it's actually the same with a lot of underrepresented groups across the world with racism and stuff as well. And I don't think positive discrimination is the answer, because it leads to that question with everyone in the department, did they get the job on the merit? And also it can lead to tensions within that. Also, it's very important to recognize this unconscious bias. And as I said right at the beginning, the people that are most likely to be guilty of this are the ones that don't experience it, therefore don't accept that it's even a thing. But we've done many kind of trials with kind of anonymizing application processes to prove that this is existing. And actually, sometimes it isn't unconscious, it's just outright bias. We also need better childcare facilities, and this is actually one of the most crucial parts, because particularly if a woman has had some time off to have children, when they come back to work, if there are no affordable and good childcare facilities within the area, they can't go back to work. And this means that it's quite often many years before women come back to work, by which time other people have climbed higher and their chances are much lower. So that's a very important one. And one thing that Jocelyn Bell Burnell talks about in that talk that I'll link in a second, the Athena Swan Award is something that her and some other academics set up, which recognizes female friendliness. And there was this thing where for certain grant applications, you had to have achieved an Athena Swan, at least a silver or gold award in order to be eligible to apply. So this was great, because all the male leads were finding it was a very competitive thing to be the most female friendly. And it meant that there was a lot more kind of acceptance of females. Unfortunately, the government have overturned that requirement for sorry, my cats are being numpties. They've managed to break into the room. That female friendliness is very, very important, and the government have overturned the rule that you have to have the Athena Swan Award in order to apply for funding, which is a huge backward step, and I hope we can change that. Another thing that has to happen as well is decreasing gender stereotyping. And again, this is not PC stuff gone mad. This whole labeling toys and clothes as boys and girls is very damaging, and the Let Toys Be Toys campaign was set up to try and address that, and it had a big impact even just within the first year. And they did a lot of research, again, which Jocelyn Bell-Bonnell talks about, where they had people watching adverts during children's TV, and it's horrendous. When you actually look at the word clouds, it's just awful. In terms of kind of medicine, it's okay, it's a caring profession, but everything else, anything to do with science, learning, technology, all labeled as boys. So that's really, really important. And I think it's great that Mattel have addressed this. We can get robotics engineer Barbie, astronaut, we've got planetary scientist, we've got astronomer Barbie, and not just astronomy stuff as well. We've got airline pilot and footballer Barbie. And it's really good that, and it's also the case with a lot of female kind of dominated roles, that men can do those jobs too. So I think it's really important that toy manufacturers recognize that they need to remove this unconscious bias. If a girl is really into pink frilly princess dolls, that is absolutely fine. But if she isn't, don't try and force her into thinking that she can't be anything other than that, because I don't think that's fair. And when I first finished with something quite fun, when I put this talk together in the first place, I was thinking, what was it that made me think that no matter what I could do, I felt I could go for it? And it had to be more than just my parents being supportive, because most people's parents are supportive. And I was trying to think, what is it about my childhood that made me think I could do anything that I wanted to? And I think it's because there were so many good positive role models, and because I grew up in the 70s and early 80s, the really overt gender stereotyping in advertising wasn't quite as bad as it is now. And I put this little board together of the people that I thought of first when I was thinking about female role models. Space 1999, my earliest favorite TV show, and Helen was great. We had detectives and police superintendents, Charlie's Angels, and yes, Wonder Woman and a Bionic Woman. But there were all these really strong females on the TV screen, but also in the music industry as well. I've always loved music and dancing and stuff like that. And there were so many very strong female characters within the music industry that I really, really loved as a child. And I think having that is really important, and it really does make a difference to young children. Having good role models, male and female, is good for young children. The problem we have today, there are loads of female superhero, female leads in movies, but they're all so hypersexualized. And there was a study done that shows that for a young girl, this is more damaging than a classic damsel in distress princess rescued by a prince type scenario. I put together these people. I think Star Trek Discovery, I know it's kind of split the crowd, but they have been so amazing with their inclusivity, and there's some really good female role models there. Star Wars have been great, Rogue One and the kind of final trio of Star Wars movies with Rey, really good female leads there. I was quite late into Game of Thrones, but I think Arya is amazing because she just didn't want to follow the path that everybody had already laid out for her. Great role model. And I actually think it was amazing having a female doctor. And you know, it's just gives kids something that's more relatable than these people in clinging leather cat suits, which they don't really relate to. As much as Disney princess stuff makes me feel queasy, I think the original Frozen movie was very good, because for the first time, Disney didn't have a lady being rescued by a guy that she then had to go off and marry. It was about sisterly love. So that kind of broke the mold a little bit there. This is one of my friend's daughter, Aurelia, and this is another friend's daughter, Josie. And both of these girls are not dressed up as these characters. They are those characters. When they're in costume, Aurelia spent an entire weekend at Solsphere running around being the Doctor. It was just so nice to see. She had never found anybody on screen that was a female role that she could relate to before. Same with Josie. She's a feisty, amazing little girl, and she did not take this outfit off when she got it. She just adored Ray. So this makes a difference. It really, really does. And it's not a feminist thing here. This is just having some good role models for people. Everybody I've mentioned tonight deserves an hour of their own. All of these people on screen here deserve an hour of their own. There are so many amazing people through history. These are some of my favorite scientific communicators at the moment, and I think they're all doing a great job, and there are many others too. I love Alice Roberts, although it's not strictly a kind of astronomy person, but I think she's phenomenal too. But I just want to thank these women, because without the groundwork that these women did, we would not be where we are today. And I know we still have a way to go to be perfect, but the work that these women did and they just proved to men that women could do this job. So I just want to thank these women for doing that for us, and I hope they appreciate how much we love what they did. So thank you. I know this talk is so long. There's another book I wanted to recommend as well. It's called The Glass Universe, and this is all about the Harvard computers and the discoveries that they made there, and the women that were doing it. It's by Dava Sobel, who's a great writer. So I haven't read it yet. I've just finished Caroline Herschel's memoirs, but there's definitely some reading material. And what I'll do is I will just grab those links and stick them in the chat. So if anybody wants to watch the Jocelyn Bell Burnell talk, which I really, really hope you do, because it was such an eye-opener. And I will put the link to the interview with Carolyn Shoemaker as well, because that's worth listening to. Just forgive me for getting a bit starstruck and losing my words in that interview, because I've genuinely never been more starstruck in my life, but she was so lovely. So I'll stick both of those YouTube links in the chat, and then I will see if there are any questions.
Excellent, thanks, Mary, and we'll make sure that those links get up on the forum as well. I have to say, obviously we've done well. We're on week 45, so we've done 45 of these things, and we've all seen talks on astronomy, our astronomy societies, and it's not very. We get people that are experts in their field, obviously, but very rarely do we see somebody speak with such passion about their subject. So, and that was really, really obvious, really, really clear, and fantastic. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
I'll give you a chance to have a proper drink of water, because that's you've literally been gone non-stop for like just over an hour and a half. So do feel free to take a minute to recover there. I'm going to flip back to Dave Eagle. Dave says he's got another quote. Dave, I'll give you the chance to read that quote out if you want to.
Okay, yeah. This relates to a hero of mine, because Admiral Smythe lived in Bedford, and coming from Bedford Astronomical Societies. His son is one of the heroes of mine, Charles Piazzi Smythe, or Smith, however you might pronounce it. And in this book about him, The Peripatetic Astronomer, which tells you all about his life, what people don't realise is that his wife Jessica was probably one of the reasons he was so productive throughout his whole life, because he was Astronomer Royal for Scotland for many, many years. And he did this trip to Tenerife where he spent a wedding. He got married, and his their honeymoon was spending months up on the mountain in Tenerife doing astronomical observations. And one of the quotes in the book here is a discussion. So because she was so prominent in his work, and probably did a lot of the work for him to do that. And one of the quotes in here is, Jessica's role as an active astronomer was a surprise to the Sicilians. One evening, when she felt too tired to accompany her husband to a social gathering, the following conversation was gleefully recorded by Piazzi in his diary. Said Senator Professor Canizoni, "What is the matter with Mrs. Piazzi Smythe?" Colonel Yule, "She has fatigued herself and brought on a slight fever. She was actually twice at the observatory on the one day." To which Senator Piazzi says with great astonishment, "What has a Donna to do at an observatory?" So it just typifies exactly what you were saying earlier. Yeah. So what I'll do, I'll copy that for you and send it on to you and
Thank
give you a bit more information. So something to add to your quotes of
I do find it
history.
really funny how much of a problem men seem to have with women working that. But I mean, I know we laugh about it, but it's still, I've been fairly fortunate that most of my dealings with people within the astronomy world have been very positive, but other female friends of mine, not so much. But I did my degree in biology and I used to work in endocrinology research, and that, no, biology is not male dominated by any means, but the sexism I experienced from some of those members of staff were just unreal. And I did my degree day release, so it took a lot of hard work in the evenings and weekends, and I got a first, and I was more astonished than anybody that happened. But when I told people in the lab, this one guy just said, well, it's from an ex-polytechnic, so it doesn't count. It's a Wally Poly degree. And I was just like, oh my God, you know, that's what people face on a daily basis. And not even to mention the very inappropriate messages that we tend to get as females in general on social media. But Sophia Gadnasa, she's been sharing some of her experiences recently, and every time she's a cosmologist, right? She's phenomenally intelligent. Every time she puts a video out that's instructional, she'll get a message saying, oh, if you take your top off, we'll all watch more often. And that just this kind of slut shaming culture around young women that are successful in their career, and it's very unnerving when you get a message like that. It gets to you, it makes you frightened, it's horrible. Now, I've had my fair share of the naked pictures sent to me unsolicited on social media, and I've had disability hate crime kind of messages sent to me, and it is really unsettling. And when that's happening to you when you are doing it as your career, it's really horrible and it needs to stop. But, you know, weirdly, the humanities have got the opposite problem. It's really female led, and they're struggling to get men to come into the field. So they're trying to kind of do stuff to encourage more men. So it needs to be equality for both sides. There shouldn't be any prejudices for either.
But not just gender. I think ethnicity and you know, social class and things like that as well. I'm a big fan of Formula One. I get very, very annoyed at the articles about Lewis Hamilton, where the articles, in my mind, are literally to rile up racists on social media.
Yeah, yeah, he's treated appallingly, isn't he?
Yeah, and you made the point actually towards the end of your talk there, Mary, where organisations are trying to change things, and rightly so, but you end up possibly pushing in the other direction then, where, as you say, it's a tick boxing exercise. You know, we've employed 4 more women, therefore, you know, a great ask. But hang on a minute, have you employed the right people for the job, or you've just employed 4 more people in this particular category? Not necessarily women, obviously, but it's a very difficult thing to do. And the ideas you talked about at the very beginning of taking away and making applications completely anonymous, for example, was very interesting to suddenly see that balance shift to a much more even split when actually you don't know really anything about the person's sex or age or ability or disability. It makes no difference. It's their mental capacity to do the job, isn't it?
Well, I know quite often, my ex-head of department when I was working in biology research, if he had an application from a female that was in her early 20s or mid-20s, he would literally ask them if they're planning to have a baby, because he hated people going on maternity leave and didn't feel that he should have to do it. And that is illegal. It's literally illegal to do that. But a lot of women face that problem as well, is that people assume, oh, well, they're childbearing age, they're going to go off on maternity leave and will be out of pocket, so they don't get the job. But the fact that Harvard had recognized this in 1977 and still we haven't fixed it, it's not an easy thing to fix at all. It really isn't. And I know I certainly have not really had any problem with people within the astronomy community. I do have the thing, if I'm sat on my own exhibition stand and Mark comes over with a coffee, people would direct their questions to him rather than me. And he's like, well, it says Mary McIntyre Astronomy on the exhibition stand, ask her, you know. And
big
so
clue,
that's,
big clue.
yeah, it's a bit annoying. But no, I've not really had much of a problem within the astronomy world. I've been very fortunate.
Some of that stuff works in a lot of ways, though. I mean, so I take my kids to school in the mornings and I pick them up as well. My wife isn't able to because of her job, and I'm the primary contact. Yet whenever one of the kids are ill, the school office calls my wife first, even though I'm top of the list. It's just no, we'll call the mum if the kids are ill. And I've complained about this and said I'm top of the list for a reason. It's because I'm always available. I work from home, so I'm always available. And it's just these attitudes are so deep and ingrained. It's very frustrating.
Well, when my husband used to one of these three kids, my stepchildren, was a chorister, so he used to take the other two to the park while the mum took the other one to choir. And he'd go to the park and the mums would be like staring at him and like, what are you doing in the playground? You know, it's like my children are here. Why do you think I'm here? And this kind of assumption that if you're a male in a playground, you must be up to something. And it's just, come on, we should be past that.
We should. Okay, back to the chat board. Steve Imar, good evening, sir. Hope you're well. You made a comment about Helen opening the cutting the ribbon.
Yeah, she did back in
amazing
20 odd years ago.
I've still never met her or seen one of her talks, but I believe she's lovely.
She did a great job that day. She had to contend with a hall, big hall for young kids, and then she come on out and did that for me. Very kind of her.
Excellent.
Yeah, somebody has asked a question about Chinese astronomers. I don't. The only one I've really found when I was kind of looking up stuff for this article was that one lady that I told you about. But I haven't really looked specifically at people in China, but I think they're doing badly now, and that they're one of the joint lowest people in terms of IAU membership. But I mean, the Chinese astronomers were phenomenal. They were so good at record keeping. The Chinese silk paintings of comets are just beautiful. And I'm sure if I look at stuff from different periods, I'd probably find more. But there's just one lady that I found that I may have cut out of this talk because this talk keeps growing and it ends up being 2 hours. So I've had to trim it down. But there is one lady that I found that used to make eclipse models in her garden. It's like, oh, that sounds so cool. I want to do that.
Excellent. Good. That was Norman's question, wasn't it? So I hope that's okay.
Yeah, I need to do more research on that.
And Andy makes a comment, very topical subject that you so eloquently covered, and yes, wholeheartedly agree. Okay, well, so I think we're at the end of the questions from the chat. Mary, that was awesome. That was really, really interesting. And actually, through the talk, I was not doing a head count as such, but made an interesting note, actually, unfortunately, about the rather few female attendees of the talk. So clearly, we've got some work to do on encouraging more diversity in our members. Normally, actually, we do have a few more, but.
I think that's, I was going to say, it's one of the positives in a way about the forum is we don't necessarily know people's gender, and I always quite like that. If people have got,
that's very true, actually.
You don't know where they're from, what gender, what ethnicity, anything. You just know some random nickname they've got, and you judge them on their contributions.
I think that's nice, because I think a lot of women, particularly as an amateur that's kind of early in their astronomy journey, doesn't really have the confidence to, because everyone knows it's fairly male dominated, and they're quite, and in some forums you do get that, oh well, that's a stupid question, how dare you even be here. In IT forums it's vile, it really is. And I know that people quite often would be nervous of coming forward and actually speaking out in a forum or asking a question. So it's good that you can just put a nickname and no one needs to know anything about you. Because did you see recently there was these guys conducted an experiment? I think they were working in I can't remember where they were working, but there was two people switched roles but kept the same. They swapped email addresses basically, and every time the female sent anything out, she was challenged and questioned. People wouldn't do as she was asked. She got berated in the replies, and it was the guy. He was posting the answer. It was him posting the answer, but he got treated completely differently when he was using her name. So I can't remember where it was that did it, but it was just like, oh my goodness, this is so overt. So it's really scary.
I think we've just got to hope that the progress we've made over the last however many years that we'll just keep continuing, and you know, in a generation, I hope it. I mean, we've been talking a little bit with our kids. Is they've been taught about racism at school, and they didn't understand it because they didn't have that concept of why would you judge someone differently. And I kind of hope as a generational thing that some of these attitudes and behaviours just die. And it just becomes that you haven't got to teach people; they just don't know any different other than, you know, equality and equal opportunities, etc.
Yeah, it's nice. So one thing that I do is if I ever get asked to do anything that is, you know, involving schools or beavers or cubs, I will always do my best to squeeze it into my diary, because I'm certainly not the only female that's doing talks, but you just never know if there's a young girl in one of those beavers groups sees a female doing something. And recently a lady from the village logged into one of my open access talks, and her daughter said, I want to do what Mary just did. And even if it's not an astronomy talk, she was like, right, that's what I want to do. And that just meant the world. And you never know how many of those are happening that you don't hear about. So I just try to always be there. If females are online and they have questions, they know they can ask me, and I'm not going to judge them for it being a stupid question, because there are no stupid questions in my opinion. And I always do my best to try and help and teach. And I was actually quite upset before I came on, because I posted my 24-hour star trails picture, which, you know, is it's been a labor of love. And somebody said, well, this is clearly not a real teacher because she's just trying to make everyone else look stupid. And I was kind of like, anybody that has seen my star trails talk will know that I've told them exactly how to do what I've just done with that. Everyone knows I've been working on it, and it's been a nightmare, and I've been explaining the trials and tribulations of doing it. And I share my entire Star Trails how-to guide for free to people who want it. So I am trying to teach, and I always do my best to teach and share all my knowledge if I can. So that comment was really hurtful. Clearly someone who doesn't know me, but
there's a lot of that in astronomy though, particularly on Facebook. I've seen, you know, Peter Williamson, who we've had speak a few times, he gets a lot of hassle and abuse.
He does.
On social media.
He doesn't deserve it.
I just don't get it. You know, I don't understand the hobby we're in. Surely it's all about looking up and, you know, gazing with some wonder, and then you've got idiots just belittling each other. It just, yeah, I don't get it.
That's why I've left almost every Facebook group. I can't deal with it. It's nothing personal against any of the groups. There was no one group in particular that was a problem, but I couldn't handle it anymore. I just had to leave almost all of them.
Yes, I've left I mean, I rarely use Facebook these days, but there are some groups that I've left, not because of the abuse that I was getting, but because of the abuse that other people are getting that I'm seeing posted. And this is not what social media should be about. It's certainly the dark side of it. Kate makes a comment. Our friend Happy Cat. Good evening, Kate. I hope you're well. Kate says, I took several years, I'm reading this out, I know Kate doesn't always have a microphone, so I'm going to read this out for her. I took several years to reveal I am female, and still hide it in general in forums, and she's been on the forum for 7 years. Kate, sincerely, obviously, we hope it's better now, and we do. I'm hoping that's hopefully that's a nod. She's going to be typing, hopefully, and we clearly, as administrators and moderators of the forum, we try to jump on anything that not just sexism but racism we have a little joke about politics and all that sort of stuff, but really, we're interested in the astronomy, not some of the other stuff that goes on. Kat says it's just natural. It was just easier to be no one. Yes, yeah, I understand.
It
Yes,
does protect against assumptions, definitely.
It does, absolutely, and that's understandable. But it's also shouldn't be there. We shouldn't have to do that, obviously.
Well, one of my best friends in the early 90s, when I first got an email address, every Friday without fail for 2 years, he would send me this week's compilation of blonde jokes. And it's just, the first couple of times you're like, yeah, whatever. I've already heard them all 18 times. And then by the end of it, I just deleted them without even opening it. It's like, why you keep sending me this? It's really offensive in the end. It gets... Yes, I have blonde hair. I can't help it. It doesn't mean I'm stupid.
I'll have whatever colour hair's going, because I've got very little of it, whatever colour it was left. So I'll take blonde.
I think the social media abuse thing, I think, is obviously a bigger issue, isn't it? Now
it is
in astronomy, and what I find odd is whenever I've been to any astronomy event, with societies or outreach or star parties, I've never actually witnessed anything like that in person, and it's that anonymous cowardice, isn't it, that being a keyboard warrior, you can say what you like that you would never dare say to someone's face or in public, and it's such an odd, such an odd thing.
Kat's just said that she's had 4 years on a car forum. That must be
that's going to be tough for
yes,
females.
tough is the word I was going to go for there.
I saw a hilarious, I hope it's true,
but
you can never tell with online, but somebody was saying that they did this every year. His friend is a female racing driver, and he would go with her to a car MOT every year just to watch the mechanics talking to him about the stuff wrong with the car, and then, passing it on to her to deal with.
I just want to go back just to a comment about the girls and groups that you go and do talks to. Back in the old days when we used to actually go and see people face to face, I've done a couple of local brownie and girl guide groups, and they are probably the most engaging of them. They just go mad for it when you show them some of the pictures, and they then understand what it is, not just a pretty picture, but what it is they're looking at and actually what that means. Their eyes just light up, and it's phenomenal to see. And there was one particular evening that we were lucky enough that we had some clear skies, and the moon and Venus was out as well. So we managed to get out, showed them the moon through the telescope, showed them Venus, which we've been showing them inside, and they were absolutely over the moon. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
That's very rewarding, isn't it? But historically, something has happened at high school age, because girls love astronomy when they're young. I see it all the time. Something is happening at high school age that is knocking their confidence and making them think they can't take it to A level. And there's been so much work done to try and get women not just into STEM, but also art in relation to the sciences as well. So I really hope that filters down, and that the next generations, if they like astronomy, will just follow their heart. There are a lot more female role models now that are working in not like at the head of the lab, but there are so many more women working in that area that do talks and all of that stuff. So I hopefully it will change.
Indeed. Just one last thing, Mary. Andy said, could you please let us know again the title of the 2 books that you mentioned earlier?
So one is The Glass Universe by Dave Sobel. Can't read backwards. So I got that off Amazon.
Cool.
The other one is also available from Amazon, and that is The Memoir and Correspondence of Caroline Herschel.
Superb.
It was a joy. I felt like intruding in her life, reading her letters, particularly to William's son John. They had an amazing relationship, but she just referred to, she really didn't like all the kind of airhead women that would go to the social stuff, and she always referred to them as blockheads, and it was just so funny. So she was you can just see the glint in her eye with a lot of the stuff that she wrote, and it was just a joy to read. I didn't want, I was like, please don't die. Please be 200 years old.
It's one hell of a lifespan though, wasn't it? Was it 19?
Yeah, and actually both of the illnesses she had in childhood killed most children who had them.
Phenomenal.
Just amazing.
Right. Okay. I think we'll draw it to a close here, Mary. Otherwise, we will be here for hours. And as interesting as it is, it's been a good couple of hours, Mary. Many thanks again for your time and for a very passionate talk. That was absolutely terrific. Lots of round of applause, indeed. Do take care, and hopefully we will see you again in the not too distant future. Grant, next week.
Yeah, so it's bank holiday next week, so we're going to have a night off. And
oh yes, it is, isn't it? Oh gosh, yes, I'd forgotten all about that. Yes.
We're going to have lovely clear skies all weekend, so you're all going to be outside using your telescopes or drinking beer, wine.
Not while using the telescope. That's
not
recommended.
We'll have a Sunday off, and what we'll also might do is, now we're coming out of lockdown, and the numbers are starting to get a bit less as people are obviously got other things to be doing. So we'll probably post up a bit of a poll to have a look at maybe reducing, so these are every other week or something along those lines, and maybe see if there's a better day for people now. Now things are starting to lift a little bit, and see what the best thing to do sort of ongoing is. So.
Cool. Okay, we'll do that. And before we go, Dave, what's coming up on the Virtual Astro Club?
Oh yes, took me by surprise there.
Yeah.
It's a couple of weeks' time, and we've got oh goodness me, I can't remember her name.
Catherine Rayner Evans, isn't it?
Yeah, and she's talking about exploring astronomy and space through phylactery. So stamps.
Oh, stamps. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that'd be quite interesting.
Awesome.
Have you changed the frequency of your talks now, Dave? Is it
not yet. We're having so we're going on until June, and then July and August I'm having the summer off, and then we're coming back in September.
You've earned it, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
He's got some Lego to build. That's what it is.
Yeah.
ISS next.
I'd love to do those, but with 4 cats, I think the odds are stacked against me being successful.
Are you having a race with Paul Money, Dave? Is that so you can collect the most models now? Is that going to be the?
He's doing the Airfix type ones, isn't he? Rather
than
Lego. He had a go at me for not
poo-pooing the Lego
proper models, not like that Lego stuff. He said.
Excellent. Righto. Well, we'll see you on the VAC in a couple of weeks then, and obviously we'll post up details on the next talk on the forum as normal. In the meantime, have a great week, everyone. Mary, many thanks again.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
We'll see you all soon. Good night, all. Good night.
Cheers.